years or so. And this leads me to think that perhaps we should take a closer look at what temporal structures can we actually find if we have this kind of like long-term historical data, and how these temporal structures actually work in culture and in time. And if we talk about these temporal structures that are usually identified within the discipline of history, there is, of course, Ferdinand Brodel's and the Annales school in France that talk about different layers of history. So kind of like there is this very fast-paced history and fast-paced changes, but then there are these long-term, longue durée types of things. And then, of course, there is discussion about cyclicality or cycles, especially in pre-modern societies. But as we will move on with my presentation, we will see that there is actually cyclicality also in present day. If we move beyond the discipline of history, I think that it's nevertheless also outside the discipline of history. It is interesting to look at temporal change as well. I don't think that we can learn from history, but I think that if we look at temporal patterns and long-term continuities, it allows us to explain where we are coming from, what are the commonalities of our present time with the phenomena from the past, and what is actually new about our time. So I think that these temporal dimensions overall are interesting in many ways. And so about audiovisual materials.
Mila, to interrupt you, we are still seeing your first slide though, so I don't know if you are moving them.
Oh, really? Yes, I am. Okay. Thank you for telling me that. Let me just share once again.
It's the thing about your entire computer to share the one we tried earlier.
All right. Thank you for telling me.
I didn't know if you were doing like a sort of pre.
Yeah. You never know. Okay, so I will just try to share the entire screen. Hopefully it will. Okay. So can you see me changing the slides now?
Yes. Now everything is working. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay, so yeah, but there was nothing, no interesting visualizations, so you didn't lose anything. Okay, so but this is something that I wanted to show you, and it's good if you can see this slide. So yeah, so for the past couple of years, I have been working on a long time span of audiovisual news production with a specific interest on how audiovisual news have been portraying the world to the audiences, telling what is important to know about the world, and of course the changes, how this has been changed in different settings. And of course, as my specific interest is in Russian history, so I have been focusing on Soviet audiovisual news production, and more precisely on Soviet newsreels. So newsreels were approximately 10-minute long news films that were shown in the cinemas before the actual main feature film in the 20th century. The production started in 1909 in France, but it spread globally really fast. And until the 1960s, they were the main domain of kind of like spreading audiovisual news, to the audiences. And in state socialist settings, namely in the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc, the production of newsreels continued until the 1990s. So we have several decades here that we can look into how the world was portrayed to the audiences. I'm not working on this alone. I have several collaborators from Kudan, and also I'm collaborating with some colleagues at King's College. And this is a multidisciplinary research team. So I have semioticians, linguists, physicists, engineers, and so on. So I really want to emphasize this, that this is a teamwork and multidiscipline. Without also multidisciplinarity, I would not be able to present what I'm presenting you today. So about the data that we have been working on, so we have 2 data sets. We have several newsreel series from the Soviet Union, but so far we have been focusing on one particular newsreel series titled Novosti Dня, or Daily News, that was produced from the mid-1940s until 1992. And then we are working also on newsreels that were produced in Tallinn from 1920s until 1990s. And this that set consists of 3 different newsreel series that were produced, because there were some name changes due to political changes. This talk is partially based on an article that I actually just got peer review comments back, and I'm working on them. But this paper is currently available as a preprint. It's titled "A Framework for the Analysis of Historical Newsreels." So I'm partially talking based on this paper, but I have also moved on. So I'm adding some additional layers here to this talk as well. Okay, so I will give you a short sample of what kinds of materials we are talking about, and namely what types of, how did these Soviet Moscow-made newsreels look like? I just tested, so I think that you should, as I will put this on, so you might be able to see the actual film, but I'm afraid that the audio is not kind of like audible for you. But just to give you a short glimpse what types of material we are talking about, so I will play this to you. Okay, so it's a pity that I couldn't convey the audio here, but nevertheless, I think that you get the idea that there is something going on in Moscow. There is a delegation meeting, and so there are many different ways that audiovisual materials convey the message that they want to convey. So there is, of course, moving image, then there is spoken words, there is music as well. There are some often visible text, gestures of the people, important people shown. You could see there was Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, certain symbols like Kremlin, these kinds of things. So it's kind of like a number of many different kind of modalities that are used when audiovisual materials convey their message. And of course this means that when trying to capture kind of like how the audiovisual materials kind of like showed what they were showing to the audiences. It is you need to choose, and you need to kind of like take also into account that there are all these different layers of modalities that are playing a role here. And this, of course, also kind of like leads into the question of what are the actual data points that we should focus on when we are analyzing audiovisual materials. And this also, when you are dealing with historical audiovisual materials, this adds yet another layer of complexity. So this is an example of our early results when we started to work on this newsreel data. We, of course, we did all different kinds of analyses. We were really excited and try different kinds of methods. And one of them was that as the newsreel data that we're working on comes with the videos, but also the metadata, and the metadata contains brief descriptions of what is going on in the newsreel, and there are certain durations annotated there as well. And we did this standard deviation of the annotation durations, and suddenly we were kind of like really interested in kind of like, as we can see here in the center, there is something in a way going on. So we were first really interested in that, until when we actually we paused and thought about this a little bit more and looked at these metadata descriptions. We realized that actually the changes in the metadata description do not actually reflect actual changes in the audiovisual material itself, but it is most likely dependent on the kind of like diligence of the annotators, of the people who actually wrote down these outlines. So what we see here is not something that changed in the actual material, but it measures the attention of the annotators themselves. So what I want to kind of like point out with this example is that when we work with digitized heritage data, there is also kind of also this additional layers of human activities accumulated there. So some parts of this data tell something about the production, some parts tell about storage, archiving, or digitizing and composition of the metadata. And there are also, of course, layers that came from scraping and maybe some metadata enrichment. So it is always very important to kind of like think about which layer of this kind of like production we are looking at, and what can we actually say about the material when we are analyzing it. So this is kind of like one important point as well, in addition to this multimodality of audiovisual materials. Okay, so let's now look at the temporal changes in the Soviet newsreels. This is a very basic data visualization of our data. So here, each frame represents one newsreel issue or one newsreel film. And here in the x-axis, we can see the production year, and in the y-axis, we have issue numbers. So newsreels were published in a kind of like similar manner as newspapers or magazines. So every year they had issue numbers. And as we can see here in the center, most of the years a newsreel production was kind of like running weekly. So they had approximately 52 to 48 newsreel issues every year. Here, for some reason, the year 1965 is missing. And then at the end of 1980s, the annual number of newsreel issues dropped, and they had also some double issues there as well. But what is very interesting to me as a historian is this kind of like time from 1945 to 1954, because here actually with this very simple visualization, we can nevertheless see that there was quite high number of production every year of newsreel issues, but only few of them have survived and have been digitized. And this actually corresponds with my experience on what is the situation overall in Russian archives. Often there is a gap between and radical difference between early 1950s and late 1950s. And here, my assumption is that this is due to de-Stalinization of the materials after Stalin's death in 1953, because there are historians have recognized that many materials were destroyed that contained excessive amount of Stalin's depictions, and this, of course, kind of like shows us in reverse way how much there was actually about Stalin in these newsreels. So, so this is kind of like some interesting remarks on a simple look at the whole data. Then let's move on to look at filmic temporalities and more precisely look at the number of newsreel issues, but also number of news stories within the newsreel issues and the shots. So here is another way of visualizing all the newsreel issues that we are working on. So these are kind of like storyboards where there is one frame per shot, and each row is one newsreel issue. So we can read that from 1944 until 1992, there are kind of like newsreel issues going like this. And we can see that here the rows are a little bit thicker, and here in the end the rows are thinner because the number of newsreel issues was smaller in the 1990s. And here it is also interesting how we can, in a way, so the length of each newsreel issue here tells a little bit about the kind of like overall length of the newsreel issue itself. Usually they were approximately 8 to 10 minutes. But also, as we know, that if there are a lot of cuts, a lot of changes between the shots, then we get also a lot of frames here. So the length of each newsreel issue tells a little bit about also about the eventfulness of the newsreel issues, how much there was about these events and changes of different shots. And it is interesting to see that there are certain patterns that usually at the end of the year or in the beginning of the year, there are longer newsreels that were often kind of like dedicated to the new year and the past events of the past year and these kinds of things. Another interesting thing here is that in this visualization above, we can see the blue dots. This is the same picture of these newsreel issues that I showed you earlier. And the red line here shows the total number of news stories per newsreel. And it's interesting to see that actually the number of news stories per newsreel is decreasing. And simultaneously, if we look at the shot lengths are becoming kind of like longer. So in a way, if we look at in kind of like over several decades in the Soviet newsreel production, it's kind of like a reverse TikTok. So so there are kind of like fewer news stories, and the shots are longer, so it's kind of like becoming less and less dynamic in that sense. So we can read this also in this way. Then we can look at the newsreel topic temporalities. So as I already explained to you, there are brief textual descriptions of the newsreel contents in the metadata. And we have used that, for instance, with BERT embeddings, to look at what kinds of newsreel topics or news topics we can see in the newsreels. So, so this kind of like embedding, or this projection, shows that there are clearly some kind of like political topics. Then there is sports. We have construction fields and so on. And within temporal dimension, we can see that these patterns were relatively stable until the late 1980s, where the politics and social categories gained more weight, and the sports became less and less important if you want to look at this in the kind of like long-term continuum. Then we have also experience with ChatGPT categorizations. And here, of course, the picture is similar because the material is similar, but also this kind of like shows that here the kind of like the social and politics became very important by the end of 1980s and early 1990s. We can also look at this in kind of like what kinds of temporal cycles they were. As you remember, most of the newsreels, most of the years had approximately 50 newsreel issues. So we should look at this this part of this figure more closely. These are more kind of like you know, random examples. And here again, we can see that there are certain news topic categories that are kind of like constantly being portrayed through the whole year. But then there are certain annual cycles, such as the red circle, the red line here that represents agriculture. And it makes sense because like from the week 25 or 30 until week 40 or so, there is this the main period of harvesting in many parts of the Soviet Union. And then it's interesting also to see that this purple here, the social category, peaks in approximately week 10, which corresponds with the 8th of March, the International Women's Day, which was kind of like a very important celebration. And then it peaks here again with the news New Year's Eve and a New Year celebration topics as well. Then we have been looking at geographical temporalities, working again with the textual descriptions of the newsreel contents. We have run named entity recognition to identify city mentions in the newsreels. And I must say that Moscow, because it is so self-evidently the center of the Soviet universe, we have excluded that because that would have covered everything, and we wouldn't be able to look at what other cities there are. So with this picture, we can see that if we have this non-temporal view, but just look at all of the city mentions, we can see that there is heavy emphasis on both European side of the Soviet Union. So the Central Asian parts are far less covered, and also East European countries and East European cities are overrepresented, which is kind of like evident because they were like these brotherly socialist countries as well. But what is interesting, if we look at the kind of like temporal dimension of the mentions of these cities, we can see that for some reason, especially in the 1950s, there are a lot of different cities mentioned both in the Soviet Union, and here below here we can see also a lot of cities abroad, and not only in the states socialist countries, but there is also New York, there is London, and so on. So, but towards the end of 1960s and 1970s, the overall interest on portraying different cities decreases, and it decreases more regarding the foreign cities. So it is actually interesting to think about whether the 1950s was more international in terms of news and newsreels in the Soviet Union than the 1970s, or if there are some other reasons for that. Here we can see also certain patterns of different city mentions here. For instance, St. Petersburg or Leningrad at that time was kind of like quite constantly mentioned. Minsk became more and more interesting towards the late 1980s, while Odessa lost somehow interest within the Soviet newsreels during this period. And then we have Krasnoyarsk, which had certain electronic kind of like construction sites that were kind of like, you know, under attention of the newsreels in the late 1960s. Then we have been looking at newsreel authors. So we have also metadata concerning the directors and cinematographers. And this newsreel series was produced in the Central Documentary Film Studios in Moscow. So our particular attention has been to look at different gender patterns of these newsreel authors. And for instance, here, this is director crew network that shows that there were certain newsreel directors that were kind of like really well integrated and collaborated with large number of different cinematographers. But if our focus is on kind of like the temporal patterns, what is maybe the most interesting here is that as we look at the number of newsreel directors and kind of like their gender division, starting from early 1960s until the late 1960s or early 1970s, there were actually more prominent female newsreel directors than of male directors, which is quite interesting because one of my colleagues who is working on kind of like cultural industry studies and has been looking at different kinds of film crews says that it's really kind of you know, it's surprising that there would be more female directors than male directors. Of course, looking at newsreel production, it was not as highly valued as artistic film. So maybe there were some women who would have liked to produce some artistic films, but were kind of like stuck in a way to produce newsreels. That's one way to look at it. But this kind of like the particularity of the 1960s is something that we are going to look more closely in one of our publications. And then I will look at the visual temporalities. So we have approached the visual temporalities of the newsreels in such a manner that we have extracted the central frames of each shot of the newsreels. And then we have run convolutional neural networks, and namely ResNet 50, and turned each of these frames into multidimensional vectors. And then we'll look at these images and visualize these vectors with the two-dimensional projections. So we use projections such as TSNE and UMAP. And for this, we are using a tool that was developed by my colleagues at Kudan Open Lab. So here you can see a link to this tool, which is open access, open source tool. And here you can look at the demo. There is a paper connected to this, and also the code if you are willing to use this this tool by yourself. So this is basically how the collection space navigator looks like. In the middle, there are all the frames projected, and on the right-hand side, you can choose whether you use TSNE or UMAP or PCA, different kinds of projections. And then we have also here on the right-hand side, we have been able to, so we have added some metadata features here. For example, the production year and issue number and scene number and such. On the left-hand side, there is a possibility to see more precisely on metadata of particular frames here. And here you can also zoom in and zoom out and explore certain corners of this projection. And here, yet another approach. So we have also kind of like online this place where you can look at certain samples of Estonian newsreels and how they react on the same platform. Okay, so but if we look at the Soviet newsreels and what kinds of visual patterns we can see there, first, without any temporal dimensions here, we can identify that there are certain clusters of close-ups, of city views, of nature, different types of meetings and industrial production. Then we can also look at these projections in different temporal settings. So in this picture, in horizontal way, we have divided the projections into certain annual baskets, which kind of like starting from 1945 until 1954, and then from 1955 to 64, and so on and so forth. And of course, these annual baskets are not equal, but they correspond with the Soviet political and cultural history and the divisions there. And yet, also in the vertical line, we have divided the scenes or the projections based on the kind of like scenes or the internal temporal settings of the newsreels. So the newsreels were usually, they started with stories on important political events and important political meetings in Kremlin. Then in the middle, they were talking about agriculture and they were talking about industrial production. And the newsreels ended with some leisure topics such as sports or ballet and things like that. So this is the logic that we are looking at here. We are kind of like looking at kind of like the yearly patterns, but also kind of like internal temporal structures within the newsreels. And here we can see something kind of like some quite interesting changes here. For instance, A here shows that there were two different types of projections of people in meetings. And here in the 1960s, there emerged this kind of like cluster of images that showed people people in meetings behind meeting tables, which is kind of like an interesting approach or interesting finding here that has not been discussed in the Soviet cultural historical studies. Then we can see that in the 1950s and until 1980s, in the mid part of these newsreels, there were agricultural productions, and then during the same years, the end of newsreels focused on leisure activities, as I told you. So, but we can actually see this from these projections. And here in the late 1980s until early 1990s, we can see this very strange bubble here that is not present in any other years. And I will come back to this bubble also later. To kind
Mila,
of like, yes?
sorry to interrupt you. Still like 5 minutes if it's okay with you for the presentation.
Yes. Okay, good. Thank you so much. Thanks. Okay, so just to show you some interesting examples. So here we can see a long continuity of depictions of Soviet leaders standing on Lenin Mausoleum at the Red Square. And it's kind of like starting from 1953 until 1987, very similar pictures. Then there is this interesting dynamic leaders cluster that emerges in the 1950s and continues until mid-1960s, but then it kind of like diminishes towards the end of 1960s. Then we have the cluster, the meeting table cluster that I showed earlier to you, that is particularly kind of like starting in the late 1950s and continues starting from that. Then we have the agricultural production cluster, where there is this kind of like iconic images of combine harvesters in the large fields. And it's interesting that this within this cluster in the 1980s, there are kind of like floating in images that are kind of like based on the projections. They are similar, but actually these images were used not to talk about harvest, but they were used to talk about economic or ecological problems like water pollution or ecological problems in cotton production. So there is this kind of like kind of visual similarity, but used to talk about different topics. And then in the end, we have this what I called perestroika cluster, which is kind of like really interesting because it is not only color that differentiates this, but my assumption currently is that the gestures and the poses of people in the era of perestroika, when people started to talk about economic problems, ecological problems, social difficulties, and so on, and it was not anymore important to pose and to show some Soviet progress. But this is, of course, this is currently my hunch, and this is something that needs further investigation. Okay, so what? To conclude, in order to analyze multimodal materials such as newsreels, we need to bring together the different aspects, as I have shown, and analyze them together. And when we are able to analyze them together, we get to understand more profound cultural and political shifts, and they're kind of like different ways they worked together. And it's interesting to see that we can see annual cycles here also kind of like changes over decades, long-term trends, and certain kinds of ruptures. Of course, this is kind of like an ongoing work, and what I'm interested in doing, kind of like what kinds of next steps, is to test different temporal measurements from other disciplines, such as cultural evolution, burstiness, cascade, collective memory effect, and how these could be actually applied to cultural historical data. Thank you. That was all from my side, and I'm very happy to discuss with you.
Thank you, Mila. Thank you so much. Okay, so now we have some time for Q&A. So if anybody has any question, you can just, again, raise your hand and just talk or write it in the chat and I can read it for you. Meanwhile, I can ask you a question, Mila. I don't remember if I asked you last year already, but do you notice, I don't know if you're looking at also newspapers together with newsreels, so if you can notice some sort of similarities or correspondences between the topics that are mentioned in newspapers and the topics that you see in newsreels?
Yeah. I haven't been looking at newspapers as kind of like in such a large scale manner. One of the reasons for that is that while some of the Soviet newspapers like Pravda and Izvestia are being digitized, they are currently under license, and it's not possible to download all the materials to my computer and start analyzing them. So there are these very practical obstacles for that. Also, in general, like Russian or Soviet newspapers have not been digitized kind of as such. But looking at overall the functions and the ways the Soviet media system worked, it is quite likely that very similar news topics were covered on television, on newspapers, on radio, and so on. So I have encountered, so before COVID and before the war, I was able to work a little bit in archives in Moscow, and I have been looking at some of the archival materials of the central documentary film studios in Moscow. And there we can see that in this studio, they were kind of like really openly discussing that now we have this central committee or the Communist Party, they made this political decision, and now we need to implement this. We need to show to the people how, you know, now we have this 5-year plan, and we need to kind of like you know, propagate people about this 5-year plan. So it was it is, of course, this is you know, directly what the like Soviet leadership wanted to show. So this is kind of like propaganda in that sense, and also kind of like the whole media system was part of that in the Soviet Union. So I think that the topics in general were.
Mila, I think we lost you.
You lost me? Hello?
Yes. No.
Can you
now,
hear me well?
Okay, now you're back.
Oh,
yes.
Okay, good. Yeah. Excellent. Yeah.
Okay.
But in general, yes. Yeah, they are similar.
So we have a comment and a question. So thank you for your interesting presentation. As far as I understand, you use newsreels both from Russia and Estonia. Did you find any difference between them, or were they the same?
Yeah, this is, thank you, Ludmila. This is super interesting question. So far, so actually one of the next steps for me is to analyze more kind of like systematically differences and similarities. But of course, I have been qualitatively looking at and watching both Moscow-made and Estonian newsreels. And there is, of course, topic-wise, there is a change in Estonian newsreels after the Soviet occupation. So, and in that sense, the Estonian newsreels become very much like the Soviet newsreels. But the difference is that the Moscow-made newsreels were aimed for the whole Soviet Union, so they were the kind of like the main newsreel series, while the newsreels produced in Estonia were mainly kind of like targeted for Estonia. And during the Soviet time, they really rarely covered any international topics. So they were kind of like very heavily focusing on Estonia. So that's maybe the difference. But it's also interesting to look at, for instance, the difference in Estonian newsreels between the independent Estonia in 1930s and the Soviet Estonia in 1940s, because topic-wise there are some differences, but nevertheless there are similar kind of like parades that were shown both in the 1930s and in the 1940s in the same place. So visually, uh, we could see that they were not always such a radical difference. So it is again like topic-wise, it might be different, and then the kind of like similarities and differences are kind of like different when we look at, for instance, visually. Yeah, I hope that I answered your question.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes. So many thanks for the presentation. There was mention of a decline in the number of stories over time. I'm wondering if or how the extent of cuts being made could affect the number of stories.
Yeah. So this is very interesting, and I haven't been really looking at so systematically the connection between the cuts and stories. But overall, if we look at the newsreels, particularly in the 1980s and late 1980s, it is quite clear that the newsreels become more and more focused on the political debates and political meetings taking place in Moscow. So there is no variety on the places which they are showing, and there are really long shots because they are mostly portraying people giving speeches, and what there can be only, sometimes there is only one news story for the whole newsreel issue. So so there is this kind of like so different layers in a way point out to this kind of like very specific focus on this particular topic. And also, of course, this kind of the economic problems at the same time meant that the newsreel authors, they couldn't really travel much, and there was less and less number of newsreel producers. So it's kind of like, especially in the late 1980s, it's a kind of like sum of many different features affecting in the kind of like shrinking number of stories, and also kind of like longer and longer cuts or shots. But this is I haven't been looking at this so systematically in the earlier times. So this is a very good question, and I should look into that more profoundly. Yeah, thank you.
We have another one. Thank you. So a methodological question for me. How useful do you find image projections for meaningful conclusions from image data? Do you find that the different dimensionality reduction techniques can tell you different things?
Yeah, I think that what is actually useful, particularly with these dimensionality reduction techniques, is when I'm able to shift back and forth between different projections to see kind of like the different ways they show the similarities between the images. So if I would see only, let's say, UMAP, and I wouldn't be able to look also TSNE or some PCAs, it wouldn't be as kind of like the differences between those projections wouldn't be so evident, and also the kind of like similarities between these projections. And I might sound a little bit unclear here, but what I mean with this is kind of as a cultural historian, I'm not assuming that a projection would kind of like tell me how things actually are, but it is in a way kind of like new pair of glasses that I put on to look at the data from a different angle. And then, when I look at UMAP, and then I have a different kind of projection when I look at TSNE, and kind of like my interpretation raises from this kind of like this conjunction of these different projections. So in a way, sometimes if I talk with some cultural historians, I say that it's similar as if I do like interviews, and somebody says that, yeah, there was in the 1950s, there was this and that. I, of course, understand that this is something that the person remembers from the past, and it's not exactly how things happen. So it's kind of like there is always interpretive layer. And I think that the usefulness of these dimensionality reductions comes particularly when we are able to look at this like them in pair or different projections together.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions? Okay, maybe not. So before wrapping up, I'm gonna remind everybody we have another talk in 2 weeks on the 27th. It will be linguistics this time, so no moving images, but texts. So if you want to subscribe, you can just also, I think Barbara sent, yes, our mailing list to stay up to date with our activities here at the King's College London Computational Humanities Research Group. Okay, so if that's it, thank you again, Mila, for coming and for coming, I mean, online, but still, for telling us about your research. And yeah, I'll see you soon. And thank you, everybody, for attending. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.